There'd be a few of my colleagues, and if I were to meet them next week and they said, "Where were you last week?" and I said, "I was down in Mallacoota." "Oh, were you having a holiday?" they'd ask. And I'd say, "No, I was working on the bushfires." "Are you still going down to the bushfires?" There'd be a lot of people who wonder, why are you still working on the bushfires? Because they've got no idea, do they? How long it takes. And even after the house is built and you've moved back in, there's still things to go on in what we call recovery. I wanted to say a few things about recovery. It's a word we bandy around, isn't it? And one day I went and looked it up. Where does it come from? It starts getting used in English around about Shakespeare's time. And it means to recover or regain a lost state of health. You recover from the flu. Wealth, you recover from a financial loss. They had financial losses in those days too. Or happiness, you recover your good disposition. Have you done that yet? You recovered your dispositions? The idea really is recover. You go back to what you were before. And so re means to go back. Cover, what does that really mean? I think in an interesting way, it points to the idea that when we are in our community living our lives normally, we're like immersed in it. But we don't realise we're immersed in it at the time because it's just all around us. We're part of it. Like the fish in the water. Does the fish know that it's in water? Do we know that we're in air? Only if we have a problem with the air, don't we? And so this idea of covery is a word that I use for my own purpose to mean I'm immersed in a fabric of community relationships that support me and give me directions and connections and values and make life meaningful and valuable. So recovery means you must have lost it and you get it back again, mustn't it? And this, I think, helps us to understand one of the problems of disasters. By definition, they are community events. If it's not a community event, it's a trauma for the people involved. It ripples out a bit, but it's basically contained. But a disaster, the whole community is involved. And we know that it's not just the people who are affected by the physical event that are affected. Everybody's affected in a greater or lesser degree. I've been quoting the research that was done by Daniel Aldrich in New Orleans, where he interviewed 3,000 people in New Orleans extensively and mapped them all on a map of New Orleans, and they were colour-coded according to how severely their lives had been affected by this event. And the map was shaded according to the depth of water. And he came out to Melbourne and gave a presentation, and he showed this slide and asked the question, what's the relationship between the depth of water and the severity of impact on people's lives? And everyone looks and looks and looks. Eventually someone down the front said, "I can't see any relationship." And he said, "No, there is no relationship. We've done all the statistics and the mathematical analysis, and there's no direct relationship between the depth of water and the severity of impact." And I can say I'm quite sure it's the same with bushfires, any disaster, because it's the meaning in a person's life and what's going on in their life. And lives are complicated, aren't they? There's lots going on all the time. It's that fabric, that's the covery, is being immersed in a complicated web of relationships. We're not very good at thinking about that. And so this kind of says, well, along comes a disaster and don't you just drop out of all of that and you go straight into survival mode and you rush around and try and do whatever you can do to help yourself and anyone around you. It shows something really profound about the unquestioned connectedness we have in a community. Not everyone, but nearly everybody. The value of other people's lives and how we'll rescue them if we can. And the research shows that you do much the same for your nearest and dearest or someone you've never seen to do before. It actually comes down to whether you have the opportunity or not, physically. It's all about the physical threat. But this is like a time when you strip everything back to the core bones of human life and what human beings are. So it's a really profound but somewhat disorienting experience. And through that, you emerge with this huge experience where you've lost a lot of the superficial things in life, and you've had an encounter. Maybe people have had an encounter with death. Maybe they've had someone they're worried about might have died because they don't know what's happened to them. And maybe they've lost animals and whatever. Luckily, in this case, we didn't lose people, but that's a very profound experience. So people have had huge experiences that change the assumptions and values and goals and purposes of life, because we're suddenly, it's all the externals are stripped away. There's also negative things like, do we still trust authorities if they don't do what we expect them to do? And do we understand why they made the decisions they made, and so on? Why they might have, who knows, even made mistakes because they didn't know enough. So all of these things change the balance of so many things. And so we come out of that into this frenetic activity of recovery. And on it goes. We're down the track 3.5 years. And we know that a lot of people are not yet back in their houses. It just takes a very long time. We've put COVID into the mix and we muck things up enormously. But if we're looking forward, what are we aiming for? Because what's implicit in the idea of recovery is that idea that you regain a lost state of health, wealth or happiness. That's the idea of recovery. When you recover from the flu, leaving COVID aside, you should be just about as healthy as you were before, shouldn't you? You recover your disposition, hopefully you're as happy as you should normally be, and so on. So the implication is you can go back to the way things were. But is that true for disasters? Can you go back to the way things were?
I don't think so.
No, because life has been stripped back to the bones and you've had experiences that may have changed your values in all sorts of ways. Are we aware of the changes that have gone on? Sometimes changes occur in our lives in those deeper layers of our values, and we only become conscious of them over time as the consequences unfold. And at the time, you don't know that you're going like this. I tell the story of the CFA volunteer who told me that she was with a truck not in this fire, it was a long time ago, and they knew they were going to be swamped by fire, and they jumped into the cabin, and the fire comes over, and somebody had jumped in, the last one to jump in. There was no room for him, so he was lying on their lap. You know, there were 3 of them across and there's somebody lying. And he was on her lap, his head was on her lap, and he looked up at her and said, well, if we're going to die, we might as well introduce ourselves. My name's Bill. Oh, hi, my name's Mary. And then all hell breaks loose, and they survive. What do you do with that experience? She said, this would have been 6 months later, she said, every now and again we see each other at CFA functions, but we don't know what to say to each other. We just kind of give a wave across the room. She doesn't know what to do with it. But she said, you know what, it's changed my life completely. My husband and I were, working 2 jobs and paying our house off and buying a holiday house and a speedboat and holidays and so on. But I realised that none of that's important. The only thing that counts is people and relationships. But he's still on that track. And we're going like this. So you can see that the elastic will stretch, but eventually, unless they can find some way, it'll probably snap. But it might take years, mightn't it? But right at this moment, something's happened. Can you talk to your husband about how profound this experience is? If it was a Hollywood movie, he'd conveniently be killed in the fire and she'd live happily ever after with the bloke on her lap, wouldn't she? But that's not real life. They don't know what to say to each other. And she's left with this huge experience. This was after a meeting, by the way. It was a school meeting. She was a parent who came along. And she just sort of burbled this out after the meeting. And can't you speak to him about it? No, he's a very anxious man. He would never let me go back to the CFA. And it's the most important thing in my life. So I can't. So there's a big barrier, isn't it? There's an irreversible change in her life. The question is, what does she do with it? It would be really good to talk about it with him and, work with his anxiety and sort of find some common ground. I have no idea what happened to them. But, it's a story about huge experiences that people don't know what to do. What we now know is the more communities get together and talk and share and exchange views and think about things, the more they process them and assimilate them and compare. Because as we get down the track of recovery, it's a bit like if we were all to get out on the road and start running to Melbourne. We'd start off as a group, wouldn't we? And after a while, some would actually go on ahead, the young ones, and people like me would get further and further behind. There'd be a few old people just a little bit behind me, and so on. We'd get all straggled out. And that's how recovery is, that as we go, there's a spreading out, because people have got so many different issues. The people who can't progress their recovery have good reasons for not being able to progress. Maybe they're doing something more important, like looking after their kids or their parents or something like that, or looking after their health. And so now that is counteracted by the way our minds think when we're in high stress mode, which is in very simple, judgmental, black and white. Have we got a problem or not? Did you lose your house? No. Then you haven't got a problem. Did you lose? Oh, you have. Why haven't you rebuilt? If you got on and rebuilt, you wouldn't be so, why can't you, etc. That's an outsider's view. But in fact, we can all be outsiders for each other if we're not careful, if we get into this stressful. So there's a lot going on in the community, and it becomes very important, I think, to understand the really fundamentals here, that no two people have the same disaster. But we thought we'd all been through it together, and that gave us a great degree of cohesion and support and camaraderie and all that stuff, didn't it? We've Mallacootans, we've been through this big experience. And that's true in a way. But when you come down to the details, no two people have the same disaster. And we've got to remember that, I think. Otherwise you get this tendency for people to judge and gossip, and friction starts to build. So we have to ask, well, what is recovery? If we can't go back to the way it was before, I think we need a word like pro-covery. We have to rebuild a new covery, a new fabric, a new, rather than have this assumption. Now, it's underpinned by the fact that governments have to rebuild everything, don't they? Well, they don't have to rebuild everything. We have to rebuild our own house, but they've got to make the roads and all the infrastructure and everything. So they get very focused on, and we've got to have budgetary deadlines and this, that and the other. So there's a big thrust to rebuild things. And is that the right thing to do? Yes, it is, but should we rebuild them the way they were? I know that in Marysville, if you go into Marysville, there's a very awkward little road, and you hit a sort of a right angle turn, and then there's a very awkward roundabout, and it's a very poorly designed town because it wasn't designed, presumably. And people said, wouldn't it have been good to use this opportunity to redesign the whole town? It's not going to happen because everybody owns bits of property everywhere. But, people talked about that. And there were some people who said, I want it to be rebuilt exactly the way it was. In fact, I want them to rebuild the police station like a fairly cheap 1930s brick building, which is what it was. Luckily, they didn't do that. But that's what the emotional attachment is to, isn't it? And so you get controversy because some people probably are not thinking that it's my emotional attachment and my emotional stability that I'm actually wanting to rebuild for, not, a creative opportunity. And so we can ask, is recovery about rebuilding? No, it's not about going back to the way. It's about how do we form the foundation for the next epoch of our life, the next stage of our life, we're moving into a new stage of life where we're different than we were before. So what are we on about? What are we aiming at? What are our goals? So, how do we view it differently if we say recovery is the foundation of the next stage rather than looking backwards? And some people have said that one way of looking at recovery is to say you're recovered when you are once again leading the life you choose to lead. Whereas for the last 3.5 years, is that right? 2.5, 3.5 of my mental arithmetic. Anyway, since fire, you probably don't have a great deal of choice about what you have to do. You've just got so much you just have to do. But when you're once again in a situation where you can choose what you're going to do with the weekend and so on, then you know that, I put it slightly different. I say, when your life is no longer oriented back to the fire and its consequences, but you're now oriented towards goals, plans, future destinations and that sort of thing, that have taken into account what you have learnt, what you've experienced. And probably that means you can actually ask yourself, given this opportunity, what can I do? And I know there are stories about people who have stopped, taken time, and then after a year or two decided to do something they hadn't been thinking about at the time. But they've taken that opportunity to be a creative new start for something different. I know of one couple who had a 10-year retirement plan down the track. But when they actually took time and thought about it, they thought, actually, rather than rebuild and then wait another couple of years and then go through our 10-year, we're going to actually jump straight to our 10-year plan. And as a result, instead of doing a whole lot of work on the property that we're going to have, we're going to plough that into community activity. So it's a different, we're going to move and become part of a community and become active. It's a creative step, isn't it? And I've had other people who've said, you know, we rebuilt quickly and we had to use all our savings. We've got no more money, so we stuck with this house for the rest of our life, again an older couple. And they said, but we now look every day and we see things we could have done differently for the same money to have a much more attractive, enjoyable, artistic house, but we're stuck with the one we've got. And then I remember this man saying, this was about 4 years after Black Saturday, he said, listening to you I realised we rebuilt too soon because we couldn't think outside the frame of what we had. And so I think when we look at where everything is now, it's not just about bricks and mortar, it's about who are we, what are we going to do with our lives, what's important. So I think that this is a really helpful time for this to be part of a community conversation. Now, I'm going to pause every now and again to see if anyone's got any thoughts or questions. And I wondered if anyone's got any questions or thoughts, contributions about the nature of recovery. Do you think this fits with your experience? Are you recovered yet? Yes.
I think the concept of shalom, or peace, inner peace for a self, that's dependent on the peace of the community and the well-being of the whole community and all our connectedness. So I think that's what we'd all like to have back again, is that peace and confidence that, you know, every time someone turns on a barbecue, it's not a fire coming over the hill.
Yes.
That kind of,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's a symptom. You could say it's a symptom of post-traumatic stress, but in a more general sense, it's a symptom that I can't smell smoke without being back at the fire. Because smoke equals fire equals danger equals huge experience. So I haven't properly digested it, haven't I?
When you still get the adrenaline response.
That's right, yeah. And I've heard several other examples today. So that will take time, won't it? It's inevitable that you can only normalise hot north wind summer weather by having quite a few of those without anything bad happening. At the moment, you've had psychologists call it one trial learning. You have such a powerful experience that you learn this is that all means fire, hell, everything, you know. And so now smoke equals that. Sirens for people, whatever the stimulus is. And I think it's really important to, because we call these triggers, it's entered the general language, hasn't it? Triggers. And I remember people saying that when I was here last year in early winter. And people were saying once the weather got cold and people started to light their fires, everyone started to have the heebie-jeebies when they smelt the smoke. But it's the smoke of warm fires. There's still smoke though. So there's not a separation between raging, threatening bushfires and warm, cosy fires, right? So that's got to happen slowly by separating these things out in our mind. Because in that state of heightened arousal and so on, everything gets lumped together. It's like there's short circuits in there. So that will take time. But what I think is really important to do when that happens, because that's happening in the deep part of your brain where your instincts are locked in, which were of course stimulated at the time of the fire in a way that shouldn't be. That's what should be covered up. We don't have to function like survival instinct creatures. We just live civilised lives. And so the triggers are the short circuits between input in the form of impressions and sounds and smells and so on, and these reactions that we've had. The way you will start to work with that is bring into play your human brain that includes language and reason and logic, because that's what gets us to reality. it's a cool day, somebody's lit a barbecue, look, I can smell the chops, or that's, I wish they'd invite me around, sort of thing. It's okay, it's quite safe. I'll do a bit of yoga breathing and calm myself down. And do that for a few years, right? Because these are very powerful forces that are harnessed for our survival. And if they've been massively stimulated, they take a lot of taming again. But it's the language and the logic, you know. Do you get worried by fog banks? No. But I know the woman who was driving through the Christmas Hills down to Yarra Glen to a meeting, and she came round a corner and suddenly hit a fog bank, and she started to hyperventilate and have an anxiety attack. She pulled over and she talked herself down. She said, it's just fog. It's wet, it's cool, it's not dangerous, just, you know. And she'll have to do that to actually stop that grey fluffy stuff being a trigger. So talk to yourselves. Talk yourself through it, yeah.
We're heading into our first theoretically warm summer since the fire, and I'm aware there's a lot of anxiety around concerning that. We need our nice not burning to get over this.
Yes. Can I come? I want to come to at the end of my talk, I want to come to the question of the forthcoming season.
That's fine.
Yeah, but that's right. And you've brought up the theme of anxiety, which is a really important one. But I wonder if anyone's got anything about the concept of recovery.
I think we also have a sense of it happened. It was monstrous and we can never go back to it not having happened. But I'm curious about how you can find that opportunity to be strengthened by that or to grow somehow out of that.
That's a really interesting question.
Rather than feel a bit haunted by it all.
It's an absolutely typical reaction that when somebody talks about a disturbing experience, they will tell you what was happening leading up to a certain point, and if you listen, that point is a really dramatic point, and then they imperceptibly leave the story and go into their emotions. Or maybe they'll go into anger. We got to this point and the fire was coming and there were no CFA trucks. Where are they going? What do they should be, that's what we pay for, and I'm so angry that I thought I was going to die and I'm terribly upset about it and I have nightmares all the time, etc. Now, that's absolutely typical. And what that person is showing you is that they're taking you around a memory loop that goes up to that point where they thought something terrible was going to happen, and then they don't go on with what actually happened. They go into emotions, reactions, blaming, and a whole lot of other things. And that then becomes the loop. So that anything that belongs to those feelings plugs into the memories of and leads you back round again. And that then becomes the re-experiencing. The re-experience that's so much a part of trauma, which is the surge of adrenaline. What's the adrenaline about? It's about the danger and the fear, as though I don't know what's going to happen. But we do know what's happened. You're here and you've survived. So the question that we have to ask then, I call that the ad break. Like on TV, they always stop for ads at the most exciting point, don't they? And if you're listening to what the person's telling you, there's always an interruption at the most exciting point. Exciting, dramatic, dangerous, frightening, disturbing. There's not always, but very often there's a disruption there. And if you listen, they go into the emotional responses. That means they're carrying an experience as though they died and there was no resolution to it. I give the example of the young firefighter that about 3 or 4 people told me about when I first came down, first few times I came down here. I never met him, I have no idea who he was. But I was told that this young bloke in his gear went out the back of his house near the forest where there was a fire break. This is all I know. I was going to protect his house. And he was all ready. And then when the fire erupted, it was so huge, he immediately realised he couldn't fight it and he thought he was going to die. And they immediately said, "Have you seen him? You ought to see him. He's very traumatised." No, I haven't seen him. I don't know who he is. But what are we curious about? He thought he was going to die, but he didn't die, did he? So there's no trace in the story of how he survived. It's even rippled out to the people who care about him, who are going around that loop. He nearly died, he nearly died, he nearly died. And the question we need to ask is, what happened next? He must have done something, mustn't he? Either the fire wasn't as bad as he thought and he managed to put it out, or he realised it was too big and I better get out of here, and he ran round the other side of the house, or he turned the hose on. You know, it doesn't matter, but he did something that enabled him to survive. And that story is not part of the story, is it? So everyone's left with this helplessness. I could give other examples of people who are stuck with a helplessness. I have a story about a woman from Kangaroo Island who didn't evacuate when she was told to. And when she realised the fire was coming, she was telling me this after a community meeting. She said, "I made a terrible decision. I took my daughter and we drove to a hillside that had been burned a couple of days before. I thought that'll be safe. But when I got there, I realised this is not safe at all. And I've made a terrible mistake. And we're in great danger." And what happened next, I say? I couldn't think. I was paralysed. You know those moments when you can't work out what to do? And she looks at me. I feel terrible. She goes into emotion. I feel terrible. I'm an utter failure as a mother. I failed to protect my daughter. She's here with her daughter. So I asked, so what happened next? Well, eventually my daughter said, "Well, don't you think we should go to the other end of the island like they told us, Mum?" And then she tells us how she drives very carefully onto the middle of the road in a white line. As soon as there's a gap in the smoke, she floors it to the next smoke bank, and it slows down and crawls along until there's a gap and floors it. And this way gets to the other end of the island. 2 people died on that road in the same circumstances. Isn't she showing a lot of competence? Isn't she? She was damn sure she's going to get her daughter out. But in her initial story, it's only that moment of her realise of utter failure to exert her responsibility, and that's what she's going round and round. And I said, "Congratulations, you got you and your daughter out. What more can we ask?" "Yes, but that moment." Okay, what do you reckon would have happened if your daughter hadn't said, "Let's go to the other end of the island"? Now just think about it. What do you reckon would have happened? What do we reckon would have happened? Eventually she would have thought, "Well, I suppose we better get out of here." How long do you reckon that would have taken? If you're in high arousal, about 100 years, because you're just stuck. But if you were watching with a stopwatch, maybe 10 seconds. 10 seconds is a very long time if you're watching a snake about to bite you, isn't it? Right? It's hundredths of a second that you respond in. The subjective experience is incredibly distorted. This is how, if you put it into language like that, we can see she didn't do the best she could, but she got there. What more can we ask people? Have you ever had to do this before? No, she had no prior experience. What will you do next time? I'm going to be out the day before. Great, you've learned something. And this is what we have to be thinking about when we're talking about the next fire. What have we learned? So that, coming back to this point, so it's joining up the narrative of the story of our experience. We don't do it spontaneously. We go into these little loops. And the way I understand it is this. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist. Have we got any neuroscientists in the audience? No, that's a relief. But it must be like this, that there's one memory system that takes in all the high threat information and puts it together and leaves us with post-traumatic stress responses because it's only got the danger and the horror, not the survival. It's a little bit different if really terrible things absolutely do happen. It's a little bit different, but that's mercifully not what we often deal with in disasters. Then we have another memory system that takes in the low threat, the reassuring, the happy ending information. Because we're not in high arousal when we take that in, oh, thank goodness we're actually getting out there. It's all going to work out. It's going to be okay. You're actually going into a different part of your brain. And, you know, there's some information now about which parts of the brain it is. We don't need to go into that detail. But it's like there's two loops. High arousal loop, it's going to be deep down in our instinctive part, and low arousal, which is processed with language and it's got words attached to it. This hasn't got words, it's got emotions and images attached to it. And so what happens is the person oscillates between the two. And it doesn't go anywhere. Because the answer to the high arousal stuff is the outcome. You've got to join. And when you ask the person what happened next, you'll often see they'll sort of, you can see they're going somewhere else in their mind. Oh, well, that's right, this happened. My daughter said this. What would have happened if your daughter hadn't said it? Oh, well, I suppose I would have, you know, you can see they're going somewhere else. They're actually making connections with information that is crucial to understanding this, but the connections weren't there before you asked. They're not there spontaneously. So, see, I am doing neurosurgery now. She wanted me to actually fix her hip up, but I didn't bring my scalpel. But no, I think when you talk like this, I think we can say you're helping people link up to neglected experience. This is why talking is so important. Not about our emotions, but about what happened and the narrative and the story and helping people put it all together. And the best thing you can offer each other is just a good common sense interest to try and understand their experience. And don't just stay within the loop they give, but to actually say, well, why was that? Or what happened next? So I think, you know, when you come to a bit that is to do the triggers, really actually go on through and say, how did I survive? Why did I survive? Those must be a very important part of the experience. Just your judgments, maybe social values and why people were there and so on. And really just keeping on coming around. And then, of course, take it to the next step. So what will we do next time? How will we make sure it will be even safer and better? Any other comments? Yes?
I have one question. Do you think in the retelling of the stories that people sometimes pause at that dramatic point because it's so hard to convey to other people outside the ones you just went through it with how deeply that...
Yes, well, what you're saying, they haven't got it into language.
Yes.
Because it's too big. They're not interested enough.
Yes.
Right? They don't actually want to know because it's very disturbing, isn't it?
Yes.
And there'll be a lot of people who, because we didn't want to know either, did we? We didn't want it to happen. But you're in it, so you have to take, and they don't want to go there. There'll be a few people that are interested, but it's a very common experience. People live, they're nested in their little coverie of security, of assumptions that don't include disturbing, life-threatening experiences. But we're going to have to get used to it, aren't we? So we have to forgive them. Yeah. But they don't help, we can't use them to help us think through it. We've got to find, that's why the community has to be able to talk together and take care of each other and not judge. Because everyone, I can assure you, everyone has got absolutely good reason to be the way they are and to be having the reactions they're having. But you often take a while to work out where it's come from.
Has there been any research done, or is research starting on the experience of the Black Summer fires and the recovery during COVID to other recovery periods? Because I know a lot of the research surveys that have come out from the universities in the last few years, they haven't included any questions about COVID, and when I've pushed back on them about it, they've said, oh no, well we're using prior form work, which is there research coming out that...
I'm not sure, I can't tell you exactly, but I know there are people trying to understand this, and certainly those of us like me who are trying to work in this space are thinking, and there's a whole language about sequential disasters and compounding disasters and so on, that we're needing to come to grips with multiple things happening, so we don't have a clean recovery process. You've got something else coming in, and something else and something else. But I have to say we don't have nice sort of models of that the way we do with single disasters. But I think what we can say with COVID is it undermines that community fabric. It undermined the recovery, didn't it? And reduced people's access to free communication and therefore processing. And that's a problem in itself. We know that there are a lot of mental health consequences that are still playing out in people's lives, disrupted development of children and young people whose social lives were disrupted, probably a little bit less so out in the rural areas like this. Look, I wanted to just again talk about a sequence that I've observed that people go through in the recovery process. A sequence, I'm going to call them stages, but they're really processes because they don't always happen one after the other. And for various reasons, we don't want them to be a nice, neat sequence. So the first process is that survival stage in the immediate aftermath. Getting through the fire, finding people, stabilising things, finding somewhere to live, dealing with insurance companies, and just getting the nuts and bolts of life together again. And that's this state where we're in adrenaline. Adrenaline powers us up and makes us focus. It actually leads to a domination of the right side of the brain where we think in pictures, because it's actually designed to help us deal with physical threats. Did you ever have a near miss in the car and you did a whole lot of things and afterwards you thought, how did I do that? My reflexes. Well, you employed very familiar ingrained processes that you never used so quickly, but they were all ingrained because you might have driven for 20 years. So you have in you the bare bones of it. And this has a very important implication for preparedness for the next disaster. Because if the information about what to do is stored in your verbal part of your brain, you're not going to get there. It's going to be too slow. You've got to be using these instinctive parts of your brain where the information is held as action memories, as movement memories. I've told the story recently. I was up in Rochester last week. You know, it was a very traumatic and sudden flood for them. And a woman told me that her, I think she's an older teenager or a young adult, when they suddenly had to evacuate, she couldn't think what to take. Her mother said, quickly, go and pack some stuff, we've got to get out of here. She ended up evacuating with 6 pairs of bathers and 1 woolen beanie. Perhaps she thought she might have to do a lot of swimming and she'll need to keep her head warm. Look, there are lots of stories, I bet you could tell me them too, of the crazy things, because she doesn't have rehearsed in her brain a set of actions that are appropriate to this. She's got to fumble around and invent it, and it's hit and miss what happens. So in this state, we just gobble up a whole lot of experience. We do what we have to do. Doesn't mean we don't talk, but we'll talk like this, won't we? In very abbreviated sentences, telegraphic sentences, people say. And it'll all be language that's totally devoted to the immediate circumstances. Now, in adrenaline, we have a mobilisation of stores of energy that we all have tucked away in various parts of our body. It's all stored and discharged. And it stimulates the part of our nervous system that it stimulates our organs to do what they're designed to do. So you have this tremendous activity. But the really important thing is that it shuts down the feedback system to ourselves, so we don't feel tired, hungry, thirsty, sad, frightened. We just do what we have to do in the extreme cases. Because they would all interfere with our survival, wouldn't they? So now you won't be in that continuously for the first few months, but you'll be in and out of it. You get a letter from the insurance company, you'll be up in adrenaline again before you open it. And so you're in and out of that state. And as long as there's any sort of degree of adrenaline, you're actually focused on the task that you have to do. And it becomes very annoying and distracting if people try to return your attention to yourself and they say, "Gee, you look tired, have you had a rest?" And you'll say, "Would you please go away, I've got a lot of work to do." And you'll say it in 4-letter words very loudly. Because it's blocking what you need to do. You're totally focused. Now, if you haven't thought about this beforehand, there's a really serious risk that you'll burn yourself out by going and going until you fall over. And when you fall over, it's quite hard to recover. And that means we have to actually understand that we are not able to manage ourselves using the normal tools we use, which is how I feel, whether I'm thirsty, whether I'm hungry, whether I'm tired. You don't feel it until you're exhausted and dehydrated and famished. And then if you try and eat and drink and so on, you can't absorb it. You're not in a... It's like you've gone to -10 of your energy level, and the best you can do is bring yourselves up to -5. You're still in way deficit. And when we're in that state, we can only think about the plan we've got. We can't think about the big picture and is this the right thing to be focused on? And people get absolutely locked onto things that are not the right thing to do. So this state, within it all, there's a lot of very appropriate activity, making things secure, finding people, getting food, etc. But there's a point where a lot of that activity starts to settle. You've found somewhere to live, you're settling down, you're not racing around dealing with all the fundamentals, you're starting to settle into a routine, but you've still got a huge amount to do. And then the nervous system detects a change. So to begin with, in the adrenaline state is, I've got a huge problem. If I don't do something now, it's going to get worse. Like the car accident. I've just got to go into action. But now we come to the enduring stress situation. So I've got a huge problem, but there's nothing I can do about it this afternoon. It's going to take a long time. I say, like a mortgage, right? There's nothing you can do about your mortgage this afternoon except, this evening, except go back to work tomorrow and stay there till knock-off time, and then do that the next day and stay till knock-off time, and do that for about 25 years. That'll help the mortgage. Right, can you see the difference? I've got to put myself in a state of mind that I call endurance mode. I'm just going to have to work away at this. Now there's a different chemistry, and I'm glad we've got no neurophysiologists in the room, but I call it the cortisol state, that stimulates the part of our nervous system that doesn't stimulate us to do what we have to do, but to preserve, nourish, heal, grow, and take care of our body. So that there's this conserving of our resources so that we can keep using them as long as we have to. You know, we all know this state. You can also call it the zombie state. Now, in that state, you can do anything that is automatic, familiar, and routine. But you can't innovate because you're not in the right part of your brain. You're not down in that reptile brain behind the eyes. You're in the next layer where all the automatic routines are stored. That's, by the way, where you want your disaster preparedness bushfire plan to be stored, so you can do it in your sleep. But we'll come to that. So that means you can do a lot of things. But did you ever try and cook a meal in somebody else's kitchen? And didn't they keep things in the stupidest places, which made you really angry? You know, so you're on thin ice. But you can sort of do it. I know a woman who had 11 moves after Black Saturday before she ended up in her house. Imagine how many stupid kitchens she had to deal with. So you've got all this frustration. Now, that state means you have a huge demand of energy, but you can't take it from your reserve. You've already used them up. Did you have a very tired patch, a month or 2 or 3 or 4 into it? That's when you're probably coming out of adrenaline going into cortisol state. Now cortisol, in that state, we actually take our energy from our tissues. Right? We break down protein and fat, not enough fat, but we break down the substance of our tissues to get energy. So there are changes in the metabolic pathways. And there's a huge resource of energy there. And what's happening is that the high energy molecules that are constantly being absorbed and created as we eat and rest and all those things, and they're being distributed throughout our body and nourishing our cells. But if you have a lot of the stress chemicals in your body, it changes the cell walls. Isn't the body ingenious? And hijacks the high energy molecules out of the cells that are not needed and transfers them to the cells that are needed. From your fingernail cells to your brain. It doesn't matter if your fingernails break, your brain has got to keep going. And your muscles, from your digestive epithelial, to your muscles. That's all that matters. There's no point digesting food if you can't do what you have to do. And so you're constantly depleting your own resources. It's like the old thing, if it's cold winter, do you break your furniture up and burn it in the fireplace to get warm? You could do it, but it won't really be a very good long-term solution, will it? But that's what we're doing in this cortisol state. But we've got quite a lot of furniture. But that's why, first of all, you're not able to spread the resources where they're needed. So in the mind, one of the first ways that shows is you can't be really creative. So that shows up as memory problems. Did you notice you had memory problems? Yes, you called it bushfire brain, didn't you? Flood brain, cyclone brain, earthquake brain. It's all the same. It's not actually a memory problem, it's an organisation of memory. The sort of thing where I have it. I'm in my study and I walk up to the bedroom to get something. On the way up, I'm thinking of all the many things I have to do and the emails from Eva that I've got to respond to and find days to come down here. And by the time I get there, I have no idea what I've come here for. Right? We all know that, don't we? And I walk back to my office because I can't remember. And when I get there, I realise I can't read my computer. I can't read Eva's email, so I've got to go get my glasses. Now I go up there, I know what I can remember, but I can't find them. And as I walk past, I see they're sitting on the top of my head as I go past the mirror. Doesn't that drive you mad? There's so much about that's a really important sign that you haven't got the leisure to properly bed down your experience into a framework so that you're in the middle of it and you've got everything under control, you know where it is. That's a sure sign. In our body, the sign is a whole range of trivial, annoying psychosomatic conditions. Muscular tension, headaches, skin problems, fingernails breaking, hair falling out. I once met a woman who had a very powerful trauma, and after the next day she woke up and all her hair was on the pillow, just like as if she'd had her first dose of chemo. Very dramatic. Some people go white overnight, and so on. You know, apart from the, it's a mystery to me, but it goes brittle and splits, does it? The end split when you're not in a really good mood, and so on. So you can multiply this by every organ system. It's showing that those organ systems are being depleted of energy. Those cells are being hijacked and they're complaining. So that goes on until the house is built, if that's what you're doing, or until we actually come out of this recovery period and things are normalised again and we are once again living a life in a routine that is, comfortable, etc. But it's not over. Just like people who move into their new house suddenly remember something they haven't thought about for the last 3 or 4 years, which is a wedding present that somebody precious gave to them many years ago that they used to pull out on special occasions and use the teaspoons, the silver teaspoons, when visitors came, and they go to get them and they realise they're not there. So we have to kind of take a mental inventory of all the emotionally significant things we've lost. You're not going to do that when you're in temporary accommodation, busily trying to argue with builders. You're only going to do that when you're actually settling in. So there's a whole period then when the implications of what happened start to sink in. And that's often a time when people notice their post-traumatic stress is disturbing them. And they suddenly start having nightmares or remembering the horrible experiences they had on the day because they've been too busy to give them too much attention. And so we need to not be taken by surprise. In fact, often strong and capable people can shut down their traumatic experience for years, and then something will trigger it. So now we're entering a new phase, a phase which starts to open us up to what was my life all about. A woman in a meeting in Kinglake 4 years afterwards said, "I'm really enjoying decorating my new house. I've never done that before from the beginning. It's a lovely experience. I'm totally enjoying it. But last Saturday I sat down with a cup of tea and I tried to think, what were the goals of my life before the fire? But I couldn't remember." And if we're too frenetic in this cortisol state, we risk losing the connection with really important values that were part of our life before. And we drift into a lifestyle that doesn't include that. It's all totally focused about all the stuff I have to do and all the people I've got to argue with and so on. Or maybe you're in Mandarin doing all these committee meetings and trying to get a lot of the stuff going for the community. That's another range of stresses, isn't it? Remember that diagram. And so I think this period is really important to keep in touch with values so that you don't put that off until you've fixed everything up. But you try and keep in touch with it, this question of what's it all about? Where am I headed? Because I call that third phase the identity crisis. Who am I? What does this mean? Where am I going? What's important? you know, and we don't have this. But we talk and we exchange, and everyone had their own disaster, and we need to share that and compare and respect each other and try and provide coverage. And be aware that people need to talk at all sorts of different times. So that's the third stage. And how long does it take to sort out who you are and what this means? What, a year or two? Yeah, but let's say you really sort out the bare bones and you've got your plans for the future, and then unexpectedly people find themselves entering into stage 4, which I call recovery from recovery. Because all of this time you've been working, haven't you? Even when you're in identity and grieving for the things you've lost and trying to work out what's life all about and what you're headed for, you're working. And when you come to that 4th stage, you feel this profound sense of fatigue that you can't quite explain. And sometimes people will say, I just don't want to talk to anyone, I don't want to go anywhere, I don't want any emotion, I just want to be by myself. And all your friends will say, oh, don't be antisocial, you'll find you'll be much more cheerful if you come to this cocktail party with me. And you'll say, I don't want to come. And then you find yourself, you've dropped out of the circuit. But it's absolutely predictable, because what you're doing is you're only then becoming to replenish what's happening in the cortisol state, which I call cellular fatigue. Your cells are tired. You're not tired. You sleep, you get up, you do your stuff, but you feel this curious undertone of fatigue. And so what you've got to say to your friends, I'm not coming to the cocktail party, my fingernails are still tired. Right? Can you see? The beds of your fingernails and your hair follicles. They must be very, very, very busy all the time. It's growing all the time. Must be a lot of energy. Let's suck that out, drop the hair, and do the recovery. But now I've got to get it all growing again. And I think this. I'm trying to make it a little bit cheerful for you guys, but I think this is a really important psychology. Now, wouldn't it be better rather than, because what are we up to, about year 5 or 6 and you've got your fingernails? But wouldn't it be better to collapse them all down and to slow down the adrenaline and move out of adrenaline back into cortisol and start doing some sort of getting things organised, and then not waiting until the end of the cortisol state to do the identity, but start thinking about what does this mean. To do that, you've got to take leisure, don't you? You've got to stop being frenetic and move into your cortex and talk to people and talk to each other and relax and think about the big picture and stop and say, I'm not going to build my house, I'm going to say we've got this much money, how would we like to change it? Maybe I have to got people to help me do that. Actually, Yarra Rangers have done a beautiful job with the people whose houses were trashed by the storm and all those big mountain ash falling down. And they had a series of community events where they had me talking about the psychology, and they would have somebody like an architect who would come and would actually show a series of slides, a very interesting series of slides about how somebody lost their house in a bushfire, and the whole process they went through of actually taking the opportunity to redesign the house completely for the landscape and end up with a really beautiful, interesting house. Now, not everyone's going to be able to afford to do that, but the message really is, here's a creative opportunity to think, I didn't think I'd ever have to build a new house, but here I've got it, so what am I going to build? And stimulating people to think outside the box. So what I'm really saying is that if we can understand this process and take control of it and start bringing in this leisure and reflection, and I think this is where community life is so incredibly important, to bounce off each other, and because often those of our good friends outside don't get it. You have the best will in the world. And then I think we do it easier. But it's very hard to get this message across to people who are, going to really have to do the next thing. So I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts about that before I say a couple of words about where we're headed into the next season.
So when you hit that stage, what strategies do you use?
Cellular fatigue,
Yeah.
pleasure and leisure. I think it's really important to take time out and to value that, because only when we don't have to do anything can we actually think about what we want to do. And all of that, how will I've got the weekend off, what will I do? I don't know. I'll have to consult myself. I don't know what I want to do. I feel restless and irritable. Okay, don't sit down at the computer and start doing emails. Just sit with it, because you're actually changing the programming that said, I'm just doing this task. That's the leisure idea. And slowly that will start to help you to re-engage with yourself. And then pleasure, nothing can restore energy like pleasure, enjoyment, satisfaction, fulfillment. Having something, you're in this huge situation which you can't control, and the essence of endurance mode is I can't solve the problem. It's out of my control. I've been talking about the man, the tradesman, who is also a extremely talented athlete who's been to world champions in his chosen field, and who had suffered a really tragic trauma. And the urge to do these heroic physical activity has just melted away. And so he's taken up knitting. And he brought me in a photograph of a beautiful little knitted cardigan for his newly born granddaughter, with beautiful little flowers stitched onto it. And he's absolutely overjoyed at what he's produced. So he's actually, it's involved in a heavy grief process. It's not a natural disaster, but he's now been able to step aside and just engage in something that he can complete and give himself a lot of joy. I think it's so important to look around. Is it a gardening activity? Is it art? Is it singing? I remember once in a very dark winter's night, I got to about this stage of my talk in King Lake West, and there was a big man sitting down the front. He said, excuse me. Yes? Does that mean I should go fishing? I said, yeah, that sounds like a fantastic idea. I can imagine sitting by the bank of the river, blah, 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 blah. And he talks to the little woman and says, see? And the whole hall erupted. He came up afterwards and said they'd had a bit of a stoush about, she wanted him to mow the lawn. He wanted to go fishing. But it could be a tension, couldn't be in a family relationship. So, I just think it's so important to harness enjoyment in whatever form you can, because we know that will build energy and it'll allow you to see things more optimistically. Fun, laughter, happiness, all of that stuff. We can't go too long without it. Any other thoughts? So, let me just talk about the coming season. Isn't it scary what's happened in the Northern Hemisphere? Isn't it scary when they say it's all coming down here next? I'm hoping it's not a mechanical system that will all just ooze down over the equator and plonk down here. Now, I think it's going to be more complicated than that. But nevertheless, the hot weather is going to trigger the memories, the emotional memories, not the reflective narratives. If we've done good narrative work, we've got a better framework. But now, I'm not here to talk about burn-offs or any of the physical stuff. But what I can say is that what's going to be evoked is anxiety. Anxiety is fear of something that has not happened yet. That's why it's so painful and paralysing, because the whole fear mechanism is to solve a problem. When I talk to people about anxiety, I use the example of, what's your name? Joy. Let's say Joy and I are having a conversation and a snake suddenly comes out from under there. You people might live with snakes, but I'm going to be on this table in about 1/10 of a second. And Joy's going to be on that one. And then we're going to get our phones out and ring the snake catcher. So in this case, fear translates immediately into action to solve the problem without even thinking. And then the snake catcher removes the snake and we sit down to continue our conversation. And I can't concentrate on the conversation because I'm... Yes, and I'm looking around. Where did that bloody snake come from? Is there any more? Did the snake catcher check under you? Can you see what I'm doing now? I'm now frightened of a snake that isn't here. And there's no way, if I hang on to that you can really... Just relax, Rob. We don't get them very often. It's the golf club. There aren't going to be other... How do you know? Did you check under there? Did you check under... You can't really completely answer anxiety, can you? Because it just might. And that's what we're going to feel towards the summer. It might be terrible. There might be another fire. Now, what we can do is keep hanging on to our rational thinking. It probably won't be. What created the last one? 10 years of drought, didn't it? Right? 10 years of drought. It's not going to be the same 10 years of drought and 3 years of rainfall. It doesn't mean it can't be a terrible fire, but it probably won't be like the last one, just like there are no two floods the same. There's no two fires the same. So it's really important that we don't just get locked in to that one and start getting ready for a repeat. It might come differently, at different time, in different direction, different quality of fire. So all we can do is really go back to the bare bones of preparedness and think about, what did we learn? What would we do next time? And how do we take those lessons away from that particular fire and generalise them for all possibilities? And the more we engage in thoughtful thinking and planning and considering possibilities and thinking through what we would do and having multiple options available. There are many people who had a plan to do this particular thing and evacuate, and a tree fell down and they couldn't evacuate. So they had to stay where they were. And they hadn't planned to do that. So it was really disturbing. You've lost your plan. To rehearse it so that you don't remember your plan as a list of actions that you've written down on a sunny Sunday afternoon on the dining room table, because you won't be able to read them. I heard this story after the 2006 Northeast fires of a man whose wife and 2 daughters lived in a beautiful place, and they had a water tank and a pump on each of the 4 corners of their house. They rehearsed their plan, which was, when the fire comes, we'll all go there and we'll start our pumps and we'll defend our house. They did that, but what he didn't take account was that the noise was so loud that they couldn't possibly hear each other, and the smoke was so thick that he said he had no idea for several hours whether his family was alive or dead. And he couldn't leave his spot because it was too much to do. He said it was the most horrible, traumatic experience. and I'll never do it again. Our plan henceforth is that any fire, we're out of there, and we'll much rather lose my house than go through that. Now, all he would have needed was a Dick Smith walkie-talkie, wouldn't he? So I went out and bought one. And when Black Saturday came, I got them out. I had charged them up. I gave one to my wife who was suffering from asthma from the smoke, and I said, you sit on the front veranda and keep an eye on the front, and if there's a fire, you tell me on the walkie-talkie, and I'll keep out the back. So she sticks it in her back pocket and sits down to keep an eye on it, and sits on the button that turns the keyboard off. Now, we hadn't used them enough for her to remember how to do that. You know, there's a particular button you have to hold down and it comes on again. So I might as well not have, I should have taken her out to dinner instead of buying the walkie-talkie, shouldn't I? Because they were of no value at all. Can you see, this is such an important principle. I heard about the man who, there's a little rubber tube that goes from the petrol tank into the carburettor, and it got so hot that it melted, so he didn't have a fire pump. So of course I actually installed a little sprinkler on my fire pump that will actually put water over the fire pump. I hope it doesn't flood it or something, but you know, so these stories are so helpful. So telling stories to each other about what you did, the silly things you did, what you would have rather done, is such an important part of preparation. And thinking about why you did what you did, and is it actually the right thing? So there's preparedness, and then rehearsing it so that it's not stored as verbal information, but is stored as a series of action patterns. So I know that there are 5 things I have to do to start my pump. 5. That's a verbal list. I'm going to give you the verbal list. You turn on the ignition, you open the choke, you open the throttle a bit, you turn on the petrol, you better do that. That's the 5th one. What could the 5th one be? What can the 5th one be? No. Oh, that's right, you better turn the tap on to let the water out of the tank into the pump. Oh. Can you see? Can you see the folly of having a verbal list? What I have to be able to do is go out in the dark and just go and have it as a like a little ballet choreography, just a sequence of movements that I do without thinking. That means I've got to start it a lot of times in a lot of circumstances, don't I? So this is the only way we're going to get through if we're in a very high state of arousal. And that we be aware that our greatest asset is our thinking, our decision making, planning, problem solving. And to do that we've got to protect our arousal, because if we get too aroused, me, you, anyone, we're not going to be able to do that. We won't be able to get into that part of our brain. That means we've got to breathe. On the Australian Psychological Society website, there are some strategies about, they speak about it in terms of emotional preparedness, being able to recognise anxiety and breathe deeply. Because there's also such a thing as emotional contagion, isn't there? If I speak to you like this, you're going to get very stirred up. If I say, excuse me, would you mind doing this, etc. We usually don't get very far by swearing loudly at people, but that's what we'll do in high adrenaline states. So to preserve good manners and thoughtfulness and speaking quietly, and just control, not because we want to be polite, but we've got to keep the arousal down enough to be able to preserve the full range of our capacities. And that means values like mutual respect and cooperation and so on. And so that means we've got to make those commitments and understand. You know, it's just like ambulance officers. They say if they run vigorously to a scene, their heart is thumping so hard they can't feel whether the patient's got a pulse. They've got to walk slowly and be calm so that they've got their full sensitivity. One man told me he'd been threatened with assault by bystanders because he wasn't running fast enough. This is the whole emotional contagion arousal situation. So the management of arousal becomes such a crucial thing. And, I think the more we can confront and think about the thing we don't want to think about, the less arousing it's going to be. And to make plans ahead of time. If there's this kind of a problem, we're going to do that. This family in northeast said, our plan is simply evacuate. Okay, simple plan. But what will you do if you can't get out? What do you do if it comes in the middle of the night when you're not looking and comes from the wrong direction? You better have a second and third option to really think about every possibility, just as a mental exercise, so that you move from one plan to another, not, oh my God, we don't know what to do. And I think there's a lot of work and discussion in that. Now that gives us at least the confidence that when something happens, I will actually have some actions to perform. And other than that, I think we've got to keep our eye on the weather and not just go to the trigger, which is it's hot and blustery and it's going to be Black Summer or Black Saturday. How will it be different? Probably we need meteorologists and people that understand fire in forests to tell us about the risk. And then it's up to us to deal with the psychological preparedness. Now, I've imposed on you for a very long time now. I wonder if anyone's got any final questions before we perhaps just open it up to a general conversation.
Have you got a generic response to those people who say you should be over this by now, like get over it? Is there something that you can say that's going to help people process that? Because it's a common thing that's heard around town.
Around town even?
Well, lots of people are getting that response.
This is where you've got the spread out. Yeah. And some people are going to be much more impacted than others. Well, I'd be tempted to say why. Why should I be over it by now? Because nobody knows what the real implications are and what people went through. And nobody knows the complexity of somebody's life during the recovery, do they? So I'd be saying things like, well, I'm actually working on it and I've come a long way, but I've still got a way to go. You should be over it by now. Should I? There's a lot of people that aren't. But we will get there, but it will take time. Now, the research shows that most people recover well in the long term. Some need quite a bit of support, but there's very few people who go into sort of chronic mental illness or something like that. But I think the risk is more that they lead very narrowed lives afterwards. And there will be a few people who shut it all down and get on and then fall over much later. So I think it's much better to be engaged and working it through than just say, well, I'm over it. I think when you say that, I'm thinking it would be really interesting to know what responses other people have given, because I think there's a value in exchanging experiences in that way, and someone will have thought of something to say, and we can actually then use that as a response to give. But I'll think about that a bit.